There are voices that do not simply fill a room. They fill something inside the people listening, something those people had not realized was empty until the music began. Michael Bublé possessed one of those voices, warm, unhurried, smooth in a way that felt less like performance and more like memory, like a song heard somewhere long ago, in a kitchen, in a car, in a life that felt simpler. People who attended his concerts would describe the experience in terms that had nothing to do with entertainment. They would say, "I forgot about everything for 2 hours," or "I felt like he was singing only to me." These were not small statements. They were admissions of something profound, that a voice in the right moment could reach past the surface of a person and touch something real. But on one particular night, in one particular arena, Michael Bublé stopped singing entirely, not because something went wrong, not because of a technical failure or a forgotten lyric. He stopped because he saw something in the crowd that the music, for once, could not fix. And what he did next, without a plan, without any obligation, simply because he was a human being who recognized another human being in pain, would become one of the most quietly unforgettable moments of his career. This is not a story about fame. It is a story about what happens when fame becomes irrelevant. Michael Stephen Bublé was born on September 9, 1975 in Burnaby, British Columbia, Canada. He grew up in a home where music was not decoration, it was atmosphere. His grandfather, Demetrio Santaga, was an Italian immigrant with an enormous love for jazz and the old standards: Frank Sinatra, Nat King Cole, Tony Bennett, Dean Martin. These were not names from a playlist. They were voices from a way of being in the world that felt, by the 1980s, almost mythological. Michael was 9 years old the first time he truly heard that music, not as background sound, but as meaning. His grandfather played it constantly, filling the house with arrangements that seemed to belong to amber-lit ballrooms rather than a suburban Canadian home, and Michael fell into it completely. He would stand in the living room and sing along, trying on the feeling of those old songs the way another child might try on a costume. His family noticed quickly that something was different. The voice had texture, weight, a quality that resisted easy description. His grandfather recognized it first and told Michael without hesitation, "You are going to sing for a living." It was not encouragement. It was a statement of observed fact, but recognizing a gift and building a life from it were two entirely different kinds of work, and the road between them was longer and lonelier than anyone had warned him. Michael Bublé did not arrive. He persisted. Through his teenage years and into his early 20s, he performed wherever anyone would have him: small clubs, corporate events, holiday parties, cruise ships. Venues where the audience was indifferent, where the applause was polite at best, where the bartenders were louder than the music. He sang classic standards in rooms that had long forgotten what those songs were, to people who had no particular reason to care. The music industry of the late 1990s had no shelf for him. Pop had gone in an entirely different direction. Jazz had its niche and its gatekeepers. What Michael was doing, bringing Golden Age standards to a young contemporary voice, had no clear category, and the music business did not know what to do with things that had no clear category. He was rejected, repeatedly, methodically, with the kind of polite dismissal that is somehow harder to absorb than outright hostility. One executive told him with weary confidence, "This music is finished. You are talented, but you are fighting a war that was lost before you were born." Michael went home that night and did not quit. He went to a small bar, set up his microphone, and sang for 3 hours to a room that was barely half full. He sang as though the room were packed. He had decided in some quiet and immovable part of himself that if nobody was listening yet, he would simply keep singing until they were. And then one night the right person listened. The turning point arrived through his grandfather, which felt, in retrospect, entirely appropriate. Demetrio had arranged a performance for Michael at a private Christmas party attended by Bruce Allen, one of the most powerful music managers in Canada, known for his work with Bryan Adams. It was not an audition. It was simply a party: food, wine, conversation, and Michael was hired to provide music in the background. He did not sing in the background. He sang as though his life depended on it. Bruce Allen stood very still after the first song ended. He found Michael afterward and said something direct: "I want to work with you." Allen connected Michael with David Foster, the legendary Canadian producer whose credits spanned 2 decades of defining pop recordings. Foster heard Michael sing and made an immediate decision. He signed him. Michael Bublé's debut album was released in 2003. It contained the standards he had been singing in small clubs for years, songs that other people had told him nobody wanted to hear anymore. The album sold 2 million copies in the first year. The voice that had performed in half-empty bars was suddenly filling arenas, and the music that had been called obsolete was at the top of international charts. The world had caught up to what his grandfather had understood decades earlier. But what the world received was the polished, confident version of Michael Bublé. What it did not fully see was everything that polish had cost him to develop. There is a particular quality to Michael Bublé's voice that defies straightforward analysis. It is technically accomplished. The control, the phrasing, the breath support all reflect years of serious work, but technique alone does not explain. Why people cried at his concerts, why strangers wrote to him about listening to his albums on the hardest nights of their lives, why his music seemed to locate something in people they had not known they were carrying. Part of the answer lies in what the voice communicates beyond the lyrics. When Michael sang a love song, he did not simply deliver the words, he inhabited the emotional territory the words described. There was longing in his phrasing that felt genuinely personal, a quality of reaching toward something that audiences instinctively recognized as real. He had the rare ability to make an old song feel like a confession rather than a performance, to strip away the distance between the singer and the sentiment until the listener could not be entirely sure where one ended and the other began. He was also, by all accounts, uncommonly connected to his audiences in the live setting. He talked between songs. He was funny, warm, self-deprecating in ways that stars rarely allow themselves to be. He would wander to the edge of the stage and crouch down to speak directly to people in the front rows. He noticed things: a couple holding hands, an elderly woman singing along quietly, a child being held up by a parent to see the stage. He remembered that an arena full of people was still, at its core, a collection of individuals, each of them carrying their own particular history into the room. That awareness, that genuine attention to the humanity in front of him was not a technique he had learned. It was simply who he was, and it was that quality, more than the voice, more than the songs, more than the platinum records and the sold-out tour, that would define the moment the music stopped. Because the most important thing Michael Bublé ever did on a stage was not singing. It was stopping. The concert had been sold out for months. The venue was enormous, the kind of space that can make even a great performer feel remote, elevated above the crowd on a stage bathed in light while the audience exists in organized darkness. Michael had performed in places like this hundreds of times. He knew how to fill the space, how to make the last row feel as close as the first, how to project warmth across distances that should have made warmth impossible. He had been performing for nearly 90 minutes. The set had been everything the audience had come for: the hits, the arrangements, the easy banter, the moments where the band dropped away and it was just the voice, alone in the air of the arena. The crowd was alive with that particular collective energy that only live music generates, thousands of strangers briefly becoming something unified. And then, during a pause between numbers, his gaze moved across the crowd the way it always did, not performing the act of looking but actually looking, actually seeing, and something stopped him. In the section closest to the stage, an elderly man was sitting very still. He was perhaps 73 years old, neatly dressed in a way that suggested he had put thought into what he wore that evening. His hands were folded in his lap, his eyes were closed, and he was crying, not dramatically, not in a way that drew the attention of the people around him, but steadily and quietly, the tears moving down his face in the manner of someone who has long since stopped being embarrassed by grief. Michael Bublé had seen people cry at his concerts before. Music does that. It opens doors that people keep closed in ordinary life. He was familiar with the sight of tears, but something about this man was different. Something about the stillness of him, the quietness of it, stopped Michael completely. He stood at the microphone for a moment without speaking. The band, reading his stillness, held quietly. The audience sensed the shift without understanding its source and fell into an uncertain hush. Tens of thousands of people, the enormous room suddenly very quiet. Michael stepped back from the microphone. He walked to the edge of the stage. He crouched down so that he was as close to eye level with the front rows as the stage allowed, and he looked directly at the elderly man who had opened his eyes and now found himself looking back at one of the most famous singers in the world, who had apparently stopped his concert. "To look at him, sir," Michael said, his voice quiet and direct. "Are you all right?" The man looked around, uncertain whether he was truly the one being addressed. The screens broadcasting to the back of the arena had caught him, and now tens of thousands of people were watching a moment that none of them had anticipated and all of them felt, immediately and instinctively, was important. The man shook his head slightly, not in refusal, but in an attempt to compose himself that did not quite succeed. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'm sorry, don't mind me, please keep playing." Michael did not keep playing. He asked for a handheld microphone, stepped to the very edge of the stage and spoke directly to the man. He asked his name. He asked what had brought him here that night. The man's name was Robert. He was 73 years old. He had driven to the concert alone, which had made him nervous because his eyesight was not what it once was and the night drive required care. But he had come anyway because this was the concert he and his wife had planned to attend together. They had bought the tickets 8 months earlier during a period when she was in treatment and the doctors were cautiously optimistic and the future still felt like a place you could make plans for. She had died 11 weeks before the concert. Quietly at home in the early morning hours with Robert beside her, she had been his wife for 49 years. They had danced to Michael Bublé's music at their youngest daughter's wedding. The song had been "Haven't Met You Yet." His wife had loved it for a quiet reason. She said it reminded her that there was always something new to discover in the person beside you. Always some version of them you hadn't met yet, and that this was one of the great gifts of a long marriage. He had kept the ticket. His daughter had urged him to stay home, worried about him driving alone at night, worried about him being alone in a large crowd in an emotional state. But Robert had told her what he could not quite fully explain, that coming felt like keeping a promise, that she had wanted to be here, and since she could not be, he would be here for both of them. He would sit in her seat and in his own, and he would listen to the music they had loved together. That was the closest thing to being with her that was still available to him. Michael Bublé listened to all of this. He sat at the edge of the stage, and he listened the way you listen when you understand that the person speaking needs to be heard more than they need to be responded to. The arena was entirely silent, tens of thousands of people holding completely still, witnesses to something that none of them had expected and all of them recognized immediately as true. The applause, when it came, was not for Michael. It was for Robert. It was the sound of an enormous crowd recognizing something human and choosing to honor it. Michael asked Robert if there was a song he and his wife had especially loved. Robert told him. It was already in that evening's set list, already planned for later in the show. Michael asked the band quietly to move it forward. He asked if Robert would be all right with that. Robert nodded, and his face did something complicated, a kind of opening that happens when unexpected kindness arrives during grief, when you have been holding yourself together through sheer discipline and someone offers you permission at last to stop. Michael stood up from the edge of the stage. He walked back to the center microphone. He said something brief to the crowd, something about how some nights remind you why music exists, and then the band began to play, and Michael Bublé sang directly to Robert for the entire length of that song, not in a theatrical, performed way, in the way you sing something to one person, making eye contact, holding it, not looking away. Robert sat very still in his seat. His eyes were open now. He had stopped trying to stop crying. He was simply receiving the music, receiving the attention, receiving the recognition that his grief was real and his presence in that arena was valid and the promise he had kept to his wife had been worth keeping. When the song ended, the silence lasted several long seconds before the applause began, and when it began, it did not stop for a long time. People were on their feet throughout the arena, not in the reflexive, automatic way audiences stand at concerts, but with the quality of deliberate choice, of people choosing to rise because something had moved them and standing was the only adequate physical response available. Michael said nothing for a moment after the applause began. He looked at Robert. He put his hand to his chest, a gesture that required no interpretation. Robert lifted one hand from his lap in a small, quiet wave. The wave of a man who has been seen and is acknowledging it, and who does not have words for what that means. That was the moment, not the tour, not the albums, not the awards. That quiet exchange between a famous man and a grieving widower, that was the moment that told the real story of who Michael Bublé was.